The other day, my son and I were eating breakfast, and as we were sitting at our table, we looked out through our window and saw a robin standing on the railing on our deck, and that robin seemed to be looking right back at us. And he sort of kind of tilted his head as birds do, and he did this a little bit, and then after a moment, he flew away. And then a few moments later, he flew right back into our window. And then he sort of fluttered down, and he got back up and he did it again. And again and again, and he just kept on ramming into our window. And after a little bit of that, I went outside to shoot it away, and then, of course, we had to go off to our separate ways, into school, into work. And the rest of that day, I didn't really think about it very much. And then I came home to this. Now, I discovered that this robin had been doing this all day long. There were marks on the window that gave evidence to the fact that it had just been repeatedly slamming itself against this window. Now, I found out later that it happens to be robin mating season, and this particular robin seems to have seen his reflection in the window and was probably itching a fight with himself. But at the time I took that video, all I was thinking was, what does this poor robin want? What on earth in our house, some trinket, some piece of food, does this robin want? Now the question, what do you want, is a big question. It's a soul question, actually, because it can start simple. You can think, what do I want for dinner? What do I want for Christmas? Those are simple questions, but when you dig down deep and really trace to the root of that question, what do I want? It's a soul question because it deals with our desires. And our desires come from our soul, the essence of ourself. This is the season of Easter. We are heading towards Easter and anticipating the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. And in this season we call Lent, we practice anticipation. We live into these practices of waiting, of fasting, even of mourning. And this is the perfect season to ask that question, what do I want? As we anticipate, as we long, and as we yearn for new life, that question of what do I want? What is my soul desire is a great question. So to answer that question, I'm going to be reading from Psalm 63. This is a psalm written by David in a time of great turmoil in his life. And as we read it, see if you can hear that turmoil. Psalm 63, a psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you, your right hand upholds me. But those who seek to destroy my life shall go down into the depths of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. They shall be a portion for jackals. But the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. Now, you can kind of tell that this was a psalm written in turmoil. Just that introduction that David was in the wilderness of Judah, a place of wildness. And the very end of the psalm, you see that as the king, David himself, is looking for vindication. He is looking to triumph over his enemies. And a lot of scholars think that this psalm was written in a time of David's life later on as he was king, when he was in conflict with his son Absalom. And Absalom, in the story of Absalom, Absalom witnessed a moment of weakness in David's leadership. And that's kind of underselling, actually. The story of Absalom and David is that's some Game of Thrones stuff, I'm telling you. Now, actually, I haven't seen Game of Thrones, but I do know that when you say that, it's referring to political intrigue and bloodshed and a lot of other unseemly things. So let me just encourage you to go back to 2 Samuel and read that story about Absalom. But in any case, Absalom decided that he would be a better leader than his father David. And so he pursues this overthrow, this revolt. And David and his court flee Jerusalem, they flee their palace, and they are refugees in the wilderness. And that is the context of this psalm. And I just want you to imagine David in this situation, that he's in the wilderness and he's going along on his donkey, and he looks around and he sees the dust, he sees the rocks, and he begins to feel the effect of the sun on his body. And his mouth begins to dry. He feels his tongue cling to his mouth, his throat tightens up. And he begins to think, as many of us do in times of conflict, in times of turmoil, he begins to think about his life and about what he values, what's most important to him. And as he's tasting the dryness of his mouth, he begins to connect that to his soul. And this is how he answers the question in this time of his life. What does he want? He begins by saying, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." David has made a connection here. He's recognizing that it's actually his soul that is longing for God. And David knows who God is. David knows that God is protector, that he is a powerful and mighty God. He is Jehovah Jireh, as the Hebrews call him, God the provider. He is God the healer, God who loves him. And David knows that that's exactly what he wants, he desires in this time of his life. He needs God to be that kind of God for him. And just as much as, he's looking around and he's recognizing what his body is doing, and he's connecting that to his desire. And you've probably been thirsty sometime in your life. Most everybody at some point has wanted a drink of water. But I wonder if you've ever gotten to the point where you were really and truly thirsty, where you've gone a very long time without any kind of liquid. Because what happens is it really begins to become an overwhelming sense. You long, your body longs for water. And he is connecting that physical sensation with this spiritual sensation. Now, if you're like me, you're probably beginning to compare yourself to David. And you might read this and think to yourself, man, I just don't relate to this. Maybe you're thinking, I'm not a poet, I'm not a songwriter, I don't know that I've ever described myself as longing or yearning for anything like David is here. It's just not who I am. Or maybe you read this and you feel guilty because you have some kind of spiritual ambitions, but when you read this, you just think, man, I don't measure up to that. My passion for God is nowhere near that. And you feel, lazy or just not up to par, like a schlub, right? Well, this is where this metaphor of water and of thirst really comes in handy for us, because what I want to propose is that just as much as our body needs water, our soul needs water. Now, I personally learned how much my body needs water as a 19 or 20-year-old. I lived in Texas and worked for an organization that sent kids all over the country out around the world on mission trips. And when I was there, my liquid intake was really, really poor. My routine every day is I would drink a glass of orange juice in the morning, and then for lunch and dinner, I would have a glass of Dr. Pepper. And that was pretty much it. Orange juice and Dr. Pepper, and maybe an occasional sip at a water fountain, but that was it. And as you can imagine, that had negative impact on my health. It was 19 when I first had kidney stones. And not only my first kidney stones, but my worst kidney stones. It was bad. 19, I had kidney stones. Later on in that year, I was playing soccer with some friends, and I went for the ball and I crossed shins with somebody else, and my shin snapped in half like a twig. And I'm sure that had to do with my diet of Dr. Pepper, and my bones were brittle. So I learned the hard way that my body needs water. And I thought that I was quenching my thirst, and I was satisfying my body's needs with Dr. Pepper, and I just was not. Now, just as much as our body needs water, so our soul does. Our bodies are made of 60% water. And so if we didn't go without water, we would literally turn into a desiccated husk, a mummy. Now imagine that that's the way your soul is with God. Our souls need God, and without God, our souls would be a desiccated husk. Now, the way this ends up working out in our life is that I feel like we end up with these kind of spiritual Dr. Peppers, things that seem like they're satisfying, but ultimately do not. And these can be things that are even God-given. Family, our job, a friend or a spouse, things that are really truly God-given. But what we find as we go through life is that they may quench our spiritual soul thirst for a time, but then we are hungry, we are thirsty again. And the reason why this is because our souls are made for God. They are made for God to fill them. St. Augustine said this best when he said that you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. That's who we are. We are made to be filled with God, to have our longings completed and filled by God. So if you were starting off with this psalm and you were thinking, that's not me, let me just encourage you to think again, that you may have longings that you don't even recognize, that in fact your soul does yearn for God, and you may just not recognize that, or you may not have the words to put to it. Now the psalm continues, and I want to go back to David and his thought process and what he may have been thinking here, because you can almost follow along with him as he thinks about what his desires are and what he longs for. He begins to think about his spiritual experiences. And he begins to think about when he was closest to God. He says this, "So I've looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory, because your steadfast love is better than life. My lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name, I will lift up my hands." Now, this is a really bold claim here, to say that God's love is better than life. And he even continues to say, to expand on this in verse 5, he says, "My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food." He's saying that there is nothing more satisfying, nothing better in life than God's love. Now again, I bet there are some of us who would have a hard time relating to this. You may have heard this, and it may have conjured up this idea of someone who is super spiritual. That David is a super spiritual guy who comes to church and he just loves worship services, and he's the guy up front who's just got his hands up in the air and he just loves God. And maybe that's what you think this is about. And you're saying, that's just not me. And you're also thinking about the things that satisfy you in life. And you might think, I could think of some things that are way more satisfying than a worship service. But let's dive a little deeper in here, because there's a progression here. David begins by saying that he has seen God's power and glory. And God's power and glory actually come from God's steadfast love. I'm making a leap there, but you'll just have to trust me on that. You can argue with Jonathan Edwards about it if you don't agree with that. But God's power and glory come from his love. And from there, he responds with praise. So he sees God's power and glory, which come from God's love, and he responds with praise. I want to suggest that maybe the reason why we have a hard time with this, maybe the reason why we don't yell and scream about God's steadfast love, is because we don't recognize his power and glory. And maybe his power and glory are present in our lives. His love is present in our lives in ways that we can hardly even imagine. Maybe the things that we find satisfaction wouldn't exist at all without God's love. Now, C.S. Lewis put this in a way that I could never do, as C.S. Lewis does. He says this in his letters to Malcolm: "We can't, or I can't, hear the sound of the song of a bird simply as a sound. Its meaning or message, that's a bird, comes with it inevitably. This heavenly fruit is instantly redolent of the orchard where it grew. This sweet air whispers of the country from whence it blows. It is a message. We know we are being touched by a finger of that right hand at which there are pleasures forevermore. There need be no question of thanks or praise as a separate event, something done afterwards. To experience the tiny theophany is itself to adore. Gratitude exclaims very properly, 'How good of God to give me this!' Adoration says, 'What must be the quality of that being whose far off and momentary flashes of glory are like this?' One's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun." What if all of the pleasure that we experienced, what if every good thing in our lives, every ounce of satisfaction, everything good and beautiful and true actually comes from God's steadfast love? What if when you bite into that succulent steak and taste the flavors and the richness and the fat of that and are satisfied in that, what if you are getting a glimpse of God's love? What if when you make that basketball shot and it goes in and you're like, yeah? What if when you are looking into the eyes of a loved one, what if in that moment you are actually seeing God's power and His glory? What if you are actually seeing God's steadfast love through those things? And I get now, when you think of it that way, why David would say that God's steadfast love is better than life. Because if God's love is the source of all these things, if it is the foundation of everything we enjoy, then of course it is better than life. Of course it is the most satisfying thing. So what would it look like to live a life of praise? What would it look like to have eyes that see the things that God gives us as from Him, as His evidence of His power and of His glory, of His love of us? What if when you lived that life, you responded with praise? This is the kind of life that Lewis himself attempted to live. And he goes on to say in that passage from his book, "If I could always be what I aim at being, no pleasure would be too ordinary or too usual for such reception. From the first taste of the air when I look out of the window, down to one's soft slippers at bedtime." I think a life of praise, a life of recognition of God's power and glory would change everything about how we live life. I think it changed David's life. Let's continue on in the psalm to see what I mean here. In verse 5, we'll continue there. He says, "My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night, for you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you, your right hand upholds me." The watches of the night were the hours from sunset to 10, from 10 to 12, from 12 to 2, and so on and so forth. And for David to be thinking in his bed, to be thinking during the watches of the night, is to indicate that he was anxious. He was wrestling with his thoughts and his ideas and the concerns of his life. And what he is saying is that at that time, when he is feeling the anxiety, he begins to change what he thinks about. He begins to meditate on God. And again, you can use your imagination and imagine David at the end of a long day of travel, thinking about that moment when he got off his donkey and stooped down to drink out of a stream, and he quenches his thirst and he feels that satisfaction of the drink. And he looks up and he sees the sun setting and the beauty of the sunset. And he goes into his tent and he sees the covering of the tent above him. And he recognizes these as glimpses of God's glory and of his love for him. He thinks back into his life and he recognizes times when God has provided for him, when God has rescued him from trouble. And it is in these moments that he meditates on. And as he meditates, he moves from a place of anxiety into a place of praise. And from his lips, from his hands, he praises the God who has protected him and has given him all these things. It leads him to a place of peace. Last week, Pastor Megan shared with us from the book of James, and James talks about how jealousy inside of ourselves causes us to be divided, causes us to be a person who's broken. And when we cling to the world, we as a person become a broken person. And this is the flip side of that coin. This is David saying that when we cling to God, we find wholeness. When our desires lead us to the source of those desires, to the source of satisfaction, we find peace, we find rest. And bring that question up once again. What do you want? When you think back through this year, maybe you've been in a place of conflict. Maybe this season has caused you to take stock of your life and your priorities. When you get to the root of that question, ask, what do you want? Do you sense this recognition that David had, that God is what you ultimately do want? That God is the source of all peace, all satisfaction? Can you recognize that? And when you do recognize that, when you look around your life and you see the many things, the many blessings that God gives, glimpses of his beauty, of his goodness, of his truth, his steadfast love, what is your response? Do you respond in praise as David does? Will you find assurance in that? Will you find your rest? We are truly made for God. As St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, in God.